After 40 years of marriage, I discovered my husband had been living a double life with another woman for 38 of those years, and they had 3 children together. I said nothing. I meticulously gathered evidence, consulted lawyers, and transferred assets while maintaining a perfect façade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At our lavish 40th anniversary dinner, surrounded by everyone who mattered to us, I revealed his betrayal with surgical precision. They had spent decades perfecting their performance. I only needed 20 minutes to bring the entire production crashing down. My name is Catherine Wells. I'm a retired English professor, a mother of 2, grandmother of 5, and as of last month, I turned 65 years old. My husband Richard and I were celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary, a milestone that many of our friends never reached. 4 decades of shared memories, of building a life together, of what I once believed was an unbreakable bond of trust. Or so I thought. The day had begun like any other Thursday. I woke up early, my body still programmed to rise with the university schedule despite being retired for 3 years now. Richard was already gone, having left for his law firm before dawn. "Big case," he'd murmured when I stirred briefly as he dressed in the darkness. "Might be late tonight." I nodded sleepily, accustomed to his demanding schedule even after he'd become a senior partner. Some habits never change, even when they should. Later that morning, I was organizing our home office, preparing tax documents for our accountant. Richard had always insisted on keeping our finances separate. Simpler that way, he'd explained decades ago when I questioned the arrangement. Over the years, I'd grown to appreciate the independence it afforded me, never realizing it was designed for a very different purpose. As I searched through his filing cabinet for a property deed, I noticed a folder labeled Westlake Insurance, tucked behind other documents. Richard and I had our policies with Eastbrook Financial, not Westlake. Curious, I pulled it out. Inside was an insurance policy, not for our home in Oak Ridge Hills, but for a house on 317 Maple Avenue in Westlake, a neighborhood about 40 minutes away. The policyholder was listed as Richard Wells, but the other name on the document made my heart stop: Elaine Donovan Wells. Below their names were listed 3 dependents: James Wells, 37, Sarah Wells, 34, and Michael Wells, 29. I sat down hard in Richard's leather office chair, the document trembling, in my hands. 3 children, 3 grown children I'd never known about, a house in a neighborhood I'd driven through countless times, never knowing my husband had built another life there, and a woman who apparently shared a hyphenated version of my last name. My first instinct was to scream, to call Richard immediately and demand answers, to drive to that address and see this parallel life with my own eyes. Instead, I carefully returned the document to its folder, placed it exactly where I had found it, and closed the drawer. With mechanical precision, I finished gathering the tax papers I'd originally been looking for. Then I walked to the bathroom, turned on the shower, stepped in fully clothed, and silently screamed until my voice gave out, the water masking any sound that might escape our empty house. That evening, when Richard returned home, I greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and handed him his favorite scotch, just as I had done thousands of times before. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the earthquake that had shattered the foundation of my reality. He talked about depositions and motions filed, about an associate who had impressed him and a judge who hadn't. I nodded and asked appropriate questions, all while studying this stranger I had shared a bed with for 40 years. How had I missed it? Were there signs I had ignored? Weekends when he was at conferences or meeting clients, late nights at the office that happened with suspicious regularity, the separate finances that had seemed so progressive at the time, but now revealed themselves as the infrastructure of his deception. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. not just fluttering gently in the breeze, but whipping violently in a hurricane I had somehow failed to notice. That night, as Richard slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, mentally calculating the timeline. Our son Thomas was 38, our daughter Elizabeth 36. James, this other son I'd never met, was 37. That meant Richard had started his other family while I was pregnant with Thomas, perhaps even before. Nearly the entirety of our marriage had been a lie. The weight of this realization pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. In the days that followed, I moved through our home like a ghost, performing the role of devoted wife while my mind raced in 1,000 directions. I began to notice details I'd overlooked before. How Richard kept his phone face down and password protected. How he always took certain calls in another room. How he maintained a separate email account for work matters that he never accessed when I was nearby. The separate bank accounts that had once seemed like a feminist stance now revealed themselves as compartments designed to keep his two lives from spilling into each other. I needed more information, more evidence, before confronting him. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Diana Reeves who specialized in matrimonial cases. "I've seen this before," she told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop 2 towns over. "More often than you'd think. But usually not for this long. 40 years, that's exceptional." She didn't sugarcoat the situation or offer false comfort, which I appreciated. I was done with illusions. Within a week, Diana had compiled a comprehensive report. Richard hadn't just maintained 2 households, he had crafted 2 complete identities. In Oak Ridge Hills with me, he was Richard Wells, senior partner at Wells, Harrington and Schmidt, respected community member, occasional golfer, and supporter of the symphony. In Westlake, he was Rick Wells, devoted family man who worked in corporate law, coached Little League when his children were young, and never missed a school play or recital. Diana's report included photographs, Richard, or Rick, with his arm around a petite blonde woman at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony. The 3 children, now adults, who shared his features in ways that were unmistakable. Family vacations to places Richard had told me he was at conferences, holiday gatherings that coincided with times he'd claimed to be working, an entire parallel life, meticulously documented and irrefutable. The most disturbing detail came from property records. The house on Maple Avenue had been purchased 38 years ago, just months after we bought our first home together. For virtually the entirety of our marriage, Richard had been maintaining 2 families, 2 homes, 2 lives. The level of calculation required was staggering. The depth of betrayal, unfathomable. I met with Diana again to review her findings. "What do you want to do with this information?" she asked when I had silently flipped through the last of the photographs. It was a simple question that required a complex answer. What did I want? Revenge? Dissolution? Understanding? Closure? "I need time to think," I replied. Diana nodded, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Take your time, but secure yourself financially before you make any moves. Men like your husband, they've already thought 10 steps ahead." That advice led me to my next appointment, with a divorce attorney named Meredith Chen. I arrived at her office with a copy of Diana's report and all of our financial records I could access. Meredith reviewed everything methodically, occasionally, making notes or asking clarifying questions. "Connecticut is an equitable distribution state," she explained when she had finished. "That doesn't necessarily mean 50-50, especially in cases of infidelity. The fact that he's maintained another household using marital assets works in your favor. But first, we need to ensure you have access to those assets." The next few weeks became an education in forensic accounting and strategic asset protection. With Meredith's guidance, I began the careful process of securing my financial future. I transferred my portion of our joint investments into accounts solely in my name. I documented every asset we owned together. I updated my will, removing Richard as beneficiary, and instead naming our children and grandchildren. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I froze the credit, cards Richard had access to, and opened new ones he couldn't monitor. All the while, I maintained the appearance of normalcy at home. I continued teaching my literature book club at the library. I arranged our usual dinner with friends on Saturday nights. I even began planning what everyone believed would be a celebration of our 40th wedding anniversary. A milestone event Richard had surprisingly suggested himself, perhaps believing that reaching such a landmark would somehow legitimize the farce our marriage had become. "Let's do something special," he had said one evening over dinner, reaching for my hand across the table with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception. 40 years deserves a proper celebration, don't? You think? We could rent out the ballroom at the Hawthorne Hotel, invite everyone who matters to us, make it an event to remember. I had smiled and squeezed his hand in return. "That sounds lovely, Richard. I'll start making arrangements." And I did, though not precisely the arrangements he was expecting. The Hawthorne was indeed booked. Its grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Invitations were sent to our closest friends, colleagues, neighbors, and family members. I selected a menu of Richard's favorite dishes, ordered his preferred whiskey for the bar, and even hired the jazz quartet he enjoyed. Every detail was designed to create an atmosphere of celebration, of honoring a lifetime commitment that, for me, had shattered like glass the moment I found that insurance policy. As the date approached, I maintained my composure with the discipline of an actress performing in a long-running play. I selected an elegant silver gown for the occasion, had my hair styled in an updo that Richard had once complimented, and even purchased new perfume for the event. To all outward appearances, I was simply a wife excited to celebrate a significant milestone with the man she had loved for 4 decades. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, I was executing the final stages of a plan months in the making. The week before the anniversary, I met with Thomas and Elizabeth separately, sharing with them abbreviated versions of what I had discovered. I couldn't bear for them to be blindsided at the event itself, to have their father's betrayal become a public spectacle without warning. They deserved to hear it from me first, in private, where they could process their initial reactions without an audience. Their responses were as different as they had always been. Thomas, analytical like his father, asked methodical questions about evidence and timeline, about financial implications and legal strategies. Elizabeth wept openly, then grew angry, then questioned if she had somehow contributed to her father's choices by being too demanding as a child, by needing braces and piano lessons and college tuition that might have strained our finances. I reassured her, of course, that nothing about this situation was her fault, or her brother's. The blame rested solely with Richard. "Will you be okay, Mom?" Thomas had asked, his voice thick with concern that he tried to mask with practicality. "Financially, I mean, and otherwise." "I will be," I assured him, with more confidence than I truly felt. "I've taken steps, and I have you both, which is what matters most." Elizabeth had hugged me tightly before she left. "Whatever you decide to do at this dinner, we're behind you. 100%. The day of the anniversary celebration arrived with perfect early autumn weather. The gardens of the Hawthorne were ablaze with late-season blooms, the ballroom awash in golden afternoon light as the staff made final preparations. I arrived early to oversee the details, the place cards, the flower arrangements, the slideshow of photographs documenting our 40 years together that would play on screens throughout the venue. Richard had offered to help, but I had insisted. This was my project, my gift to him. Another lie in a marriage built on them. As I adjusted a centerpiece of white roses and silver eucalyptus, my phone chimed with a text. It was from Diana Reeves. "Confirmed. Both parties will be in attendance." My heart stuttered in my chest before resuming its rhythm. Elaine Donovan Wells and her children, Richard's other children, had RSVP'd to their private invitations, sent weeks after the official ones went out to our regular guests. They had been told only that it was an important event concerning Richard Wells, one that would impact their future. Curiosity had done the rest. I checked my watch. 3 hours until the event began. 3 hours until 4 decades of deception would collapse like a house of cards. 3 hours until I reclaimed my dignity, my agency, my truth. For 40 years, I had been an unwitting character in Richard's elaborate production. Tonight, finally, I would write my own ending to the story. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and continued arranging white roses, each one a perfect symbol of the purity and honesty that our marriage had lacked. The confrontation that loomed ahead would be painful, public, and permanent. There would be no going back once certain words were spoken, certain truths revealed. But as I placed the final rose in the arrangement, I knew with absolute certainty that I was ready. More than ready, I was resolute. For too long, I had lived in the shadow of Richard's lies. Tonight, in front of everyone who mattered to both of us, I would step into the light of truth, whatever came after. The Hawthorne Hotel's grand ballroom transformed as evening fell. Hundreds of candles flickered to life, their golden glow reflecting off crystal glassware and polished silver. The quartet began to play softly in the corner, the gentle notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filling the space as early guests arrived. I stood at the entrance, a flute of champagne in my hand that I had no intention of drinking, watching as Richard greeted each arrival with the practiced charm of a man who had spent his life in courtrooms, persuading others to believe his version of events. My gown, a deep midnight blue rather than the expected ruby red of a 40th anniversary, shimmered under the chandeliers. "You're not wearing red?" Richard had asked when he first saw me at home, his brow furrowed slightly. I thought that was traditional for a 40th. I had offered him an enigmatic smile. Blue has always been my color. Tonight is about being true to myself. He had accepted this with a nod, the subtle warning in my words sliding past him unnoticed. Thomas arrived early with his wife Amanda, and their 3 children. His eyes met mine across the room, a silent question in them. I gave a slight nod, confirming that yes, the plan was still in motion. Elizabeth and her husband David came soon after, their twin daughters dressed in matching blue dresses that mirrored mine, a coincidence that felt like cosmic affirmation. Elizabeth squeezed my hand as she kissed my cheek. "You look beautiful, Mom," she whispered, "and strong." By 7:30, the ballroom was filled with over 100 guests, colleagues from Richard's law firm and my university, friends we'd known for decades, extended family who had flown in for the occasion. I watched as Richard worked the room, accepting congratulations and slapping backs, every inch the successful attorney celebrating a lifetime achievement. He had always been good at this, making others believe in the narrative he constructed, whether in a courtroom or at a social gathering. "Everything looks lovely, Catherine," said Margaret Harrington, the wife of Richard's law partner and my friend of 30 years. 40 years. Quite an accomplishment these days. "Yes," I replied, meeting her eyes. "Quite extraordinary what some people can sustain." Something in my tone must have registered, because Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying me with new attention. "Are you all right, dear?" I smiled, the expression not quite reaching my eyes. "I'm about to be." At 8 o'clock, the maitre d' announced dinner would be served shortly. Guests began finding their place cards and moving toward their assigned tables. I had arranged the seating with surgical precision. Richard's colleagues at tables near the front, our closest friends scattered strategically throughout the room. Family members positioned where they could observe without being directly in the line of fire. Tables 11 and 12 in the far corner remained conspicuously empty. Their occupants had not yet arrived. Richard joined me at the head table, where Thomas, Elizabeth, and their families were already seated. He placed his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that once would have felt intimate but now made my skin crawl. "Quite a turnout," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Half the state judiciary is here." "Yes," I said quietly. "It seems everyone who matters has come to witness this occasion." Richard raised his eyebrows slightly at my word choice but was distracted by the arrival of Judge Carson, an important connection for his firm. As he turned away to greet the judge, I checked my phone. A text from Diana Reeves appeared. "They're here. 5 minutes." I took a deep breath and signaled to the maitre d'. It was time to begin. The lights dimmed slightly as the maitre d' tapped a microphone at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. Mr. and Mrs. Wells welcome you to this celebration of their 40 years of marriage. Dinner will be served momentarily, but first, Mrs. Wells would like to say a few words." A spotlight found me as I rose from my seat and made my way to the podium. The room fell silent, faces turned expectantly toward me, smiles anticipating the usual platitudes of long-married couples, gratitude for shared years, gentle jokes about endurance, warm acknowledgement of love's perseverance. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Looking around this room, I see the tapestry of a life shared, colleagues who have become friends, neighbors who have become family, children who have grown into remarkable adults." I paused, letting my gaze move around the room, making eye contact with familiar faces. For 40 years, Richard and I have built what appeared to be a life together. We've celebrated triumphs, weathered challenges, raised children, and now, delight in grandchildren. Richard was watching me from our table, his expression pleased but slightly confused by my phrasing. What appeared to be a life together was not the expected language of an anniversary toast. "Many of you have asked me over the years what the secret is to a long marriage," I continued. "I used to say trust, communication, shared values. Now I know better." The room had grown utterly silent, the shift in my tone registering with the audience. Now I understand that the secret can be compartmentalization, deception, and extraordinary commitment to maintaining elaborate lies. A murmur rippled through the guests. Richard's smile froze, his body tensing visibly even from across the room. 4 months ago, I discovered that my husband of 40 years has been living a double life for 38 of those years. My voice remained calm, almost conversational, as if I were discussing an interesting sociological phenomenon rather than the decimation of my life. Richard has maintained a second home, a second family, complete with 3 children and now grandchildren, in Westlake, 40 minutes from the house we've shared in Oak Ridge Hills. The murmuring grew louder. I saw Richard half rise from his seat, his face draining of color, but Thomas placed a restraining hand on his arm, keeping him seated. The movement was subtle but firm. We had discussed this moment. Richard would not be allowed to interrupt my reckoning. "For those of you who might require evidence before believing such an extraordinary claim," I continued, "I've prepared a brief presentation." I nodded to the technical assistant at the back of the room who had been instructed to operate the slideshow monitors. The screens around the ballroom flickered to life, displaying the first of Diana Reeves's photographs, Richard with his arm, around Elaine Donovan Wells at a high school graduation ceremony, their son James in cap and gown between them. The date stamp in the corner read June 2003. This was taken the same week Richard told me he was at a legal conference in Chicago, I explained, my voice still measured. Our son Thomas had just finished his first year of college. Richard was sorry to miss his return home for the summer, but work obligations couldn't be rescheduled. The image changed to show Richard cutting a cake shaped like the number 30, surrounded by Elaine and their 3 children, all raising glasses in celebration. This was their 30th anniversary celebration, I said. It occurred 3 weeks before our 30th anniversary, which Richard commemorated by taking me to dinner at Marcello's and giving me this necklace. I touched the pendant at my throat. A necklace identical to the one Elaine is wearing in this photograph. Gasps and whispers filled the room as image after image appeared on the screens. Richard at Sarah's wedding, Richard holding a newborn grandchild, Richard on vacation with his other family in places he had claimed to be working. The evidence was irrefutable, a digital catalog of betrayal spanning decades. Throughout the presentation, I kept my eyes on Richard. His face had moved through a progression of emotions: shock, anger, desperate calculation, and finally, a kind of defeated resignation as he realized the thoroughness of my evidence and the inescapability of this moment. When the final image faded from the screens, I allowed the silence to fill the room for several heartbeats before speaking again. Many of you are wondering why I would choose to share this revelation in such a public manner. I let my gaze move across the stunned faces of our guests. The answer is simple. Richard has carefully curated his public image for 40 years, building a reputation as an honorable man, a devoted husband, a respected attorney. That image has been as meticulously constructed as it is fundamentally false. It seemed only fitting that its dismantling should occur in the presence of those who have been unwitting participants in sustaining it. I looked directly at Richard now. For decades, you have divided your life between two women, two families, living a fractured existence that required elaborate deception to maintain. But the most intimate relationship you've maintained all these years wasn't with either me or Elaine. It was with lies. They have been your most constant companion, your most reliable partner. Richard's face had gone ashen. He looked suddenly older, diminished, the confident attorney replaced by a cornered man with no recourse to legal maneuvers or persuasive rhetoric. I have, of course, taken steps to protect myself financially, I continued, turning back to the audience. The details of that are private, but I want to assure our children and friends that I will be secure. As for the legal status of our marriage, those proceedings will begin next week. I paused, taking a moment to collect myself before the final act. There is one more element to tonight's revelation. I turned toward the back of the ballroom, where the maitre d' stood by the double doors. Please show in our final guests. The doors opened to reveal Diana Reeves escorting a group of 5 people, a blonde woman in her early 60s, 3 adults in their 30s, and a man who appeared to be one of their spouses. The woman, Elaine Donovan Wells, I presumed, looked confused and increasingly alarmed as she registered the nature of the gathering she had entered. Elaine, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom. Thank you for coming. I believe you know Richard Wells, or as you may call him Rick, your husband of 38 years. Elaine's eyes widened as they locked on Richard, who had gone completely still at our table. Her confusion gave way to understanding, then to a horror that mirrored what I had felt in our home office months ago. Rick? She said, her voice barely audible even in the silent room. What is this? Who are these people? These people, I replied, include Richard's other children, Thomas and Elizabeth, and his other grandchildren. I gestured toward our family table. Just as the people with you include his children James, Sarah, and Michael, whom I've never had the opportunity to meet. The 3 adults with Elaine looked shell-shocked, their eyes moving from Richard to me to the presentation screens, which now displayed their own photographs alongside our family photos, a grotesque parallel family album. I don't understand, said the man who must be James, Richard's other eldest son. His voice was eerily similar to Thomas's. Dad? What's going on? Richard finally found his voice, though it emerged as a hoarse whisper. This isn't... I can explain. Can you really? I interrupted, my composure finally cracking slightly. Can you explain maintaining 2 complete families for nearly 4 decades? Can you explain the thousands of lies you've told to cover hundreds of absences? Can you explain how you justified building your entire life on deception? I turned back to Elaine and her children, who remained frozen at the back of the ballroom. I didn't invite you here to hurt you, though I know this revelation is devastating. I invited you because you deserve the truth as much as I did. You deserve to know the man you've built your lives around. And you deserve to make informed choices about your future, just as I am making mine. The room had become unbearably tense, the weight of collective shock almost palpable. Richard looked trapped between the two halves of his fractured life, unable to move toward either one without confirming his betrayal of the other. "I have nothing more to say to you, Richard," I said, my voice growing quiet but still carrying through the silent room. 40 years ago, I made vows to a man I believed in. That man, I now understand, never existed. He was a character you performed, a role you played when it suited you. Well, your performance has come to an end. The curtain is falling. The audience has seen behind the scenes. I removed my wedding ring and placed it on the podium with a soft but distinct click that seemed to echo through the ballroom. The rest of us, your children from both families, the colleagues who trusted you, the friends who believed in you, we will need to determine individually what relationship, if any, we wish to maintain with you going forward. That is for each person to decide. But as for me, I have already decided. Our marriage ended the moment I found that insurance policy, though in truth, it was never what I believed it to be. I stepped away from the podium, my part in this drama complete. As I moved toward the exit, the room remained utterly silent, a tableau of shocked faces frozen in the moment of revelation. I didn't look back at Richard or at Elaine. I had said what needed to be said, revealed what needed to be revealed. The aftermath would unfold without me. Thomas and Elizabeth rose from their seats to follow me, their spouses and children gathering coats and purses. We had prepared for this moment, arranged for a suite upstairs where we could retreat from the public spectacle. As we walked toward the ballroom doors, the silence finally broke. A growing wave of whispers, exclamations, and movement as the guests processed what they had witnessed. Richard called out once, "Catherine, wait!" But I continued walking, my children forming a protective barrier around me. His voice, once so authoritative in courtrooms and at dinner parties, now sounded hollow, stripped of the power that deception had lent it for so long. As the ballroom doors closed behind us, I took my first deep breath in what felt like hours. Thomas squeezed my shoulder, while Elizabeth took my hand in hers. "You did it, Mom," she said softly. "It's over." But as we walked toward the elevator, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. The confrontation was complete, but the process of rebuilding my life had only just begun. Ahead lay practical matters of divorce, financial separation, and legal proceedings. But more importantly, there was the deeper work of reclaiming my sense of self, of understanding who Catherine Wells was when she was no longer defined by a marriage built on lies. For 40 years, I had lived a story written largely by Richard's deception. Now, finally, I would write my own. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I woke in the hotel suite to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't place where I was or why I was there. Then, the events of the previous night crashed back into my consciousness. The presentation, Richard's face crumpling under the weight of exposed lies, Elaine's dawning horror as her life, unraveled in a room full of strangers. I had expected to feel vindicated, perhaps even triumphant. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, as if I had shed an exoskeleton that had both protected and confined me. Thomas knocked softly on the door connecting our rooms. When I called for him to enter, he appeared with a room service tray, coffee, toast, fruit I wouldn't eat but appreciated for the gesture. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the tray on the desk by the window. "Like I've survived something," I replied after a moment's consideration. "A plane crash, perhaps. Or a natural disaster." Thomas nodded, his father's analytical mind, showing in the careful way he studied me. The lobby is crawling with Dad's colleagues, some reporters too. Word got out. Of course it had. A scandal involving a prominent attorney with two families was exactly the kind of story that traveled fast in legal circles. By Monday, it would likely reach the local news. I couldn't bring myself to care. Elizabeth made reservations for brunch. At Westfield's, Thomas continued. Private room in the back, 11 o'clock if you're up for it. I nodded, grateful for my children's foresight. They had anticipated that I might need sanctuary this morning, a sheltered space to process before facing the world that had tilted on its axis. After Thomas left, I showered and dressed in clothes. Elizabeth had packed for me, not the ones I'd brought to the hotel for the anniversary weekend, which carried the taint of my old life, but fresh ones she'd collected from my closet yesterday afternoon while Richard was at his office. The simple act of putting on clothes my daughter had chosen felt like stepping into a new identity. My phone had been off since the dinner. Now, reluctantly, I powered it on, bracing for the deluge. Immediately, notifications flooded the screen. 27 voicemails, 43 text messages, 68 emails. Richard's name appeared repeatedly, alongside those of friends, colleagues, family members. I set the phone aside without reading any of them. They could wait. Today was for regrouping, for breathing, for beginning to imagine a future I had never planned for. At Westfield's, Elizabeth and her family had already claimed the private dining area, a sunlit alcove separated from the main restaurant by French doors. Thomas, Amanda, and their children arrived moments after I did. The grandchildren, blessedly, seemed unaffected by the previous night's drama, chattering about cartoons and playground politics as if their grandfather hadn't just been exposed as living a double life for nearly 4 decades. Mom, Elizabeth said once we were all seated and the server had taken our orders. We need to talk about practicalities. Always the organized one. She had a notepad beside her plate, several items already listed in her neat handwriting. Where will you stay? The house in Oak Ridge is half mine, legally, I finished for her. And I have no intention of leaving it. Richard can find other accommodations. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Thomas. Dad's been calling us both non-stop, Thomas said. He's, well, desperate would be the word, wants to meet with you, says there are explanations we need to hear. What possible explanation could justify 40 years of deception? I asked, not expecting an answer. No, I have no interest in hearing Richard's justifications. My attorney will communicate with his from now on. The conversation shifted to practical matters, changing locks, securing financial accounts, updating legal documents. My children had already sprung into protective action, researching steps to shield me from whatever fallout might come. Their competence and care brought the first genuine warmth I'd felt since the discovery of Richard's betrayal. There's something else? Elizabeth said hesitantly as our meals arrived. We've been contacted by the others, James and Sarah. She avoided saying your husband's other children, for which I was grateful. They want to meet you. I set down my fork, appetite vanishing. Why? They said they have questions only you can answer, Thomas explained. About when it started, what he told you about his schedule all these years. Apparently their mother is in no condition to discuss it. I could well imagine Elaine's state. Her world had imploded in front of strangers. At least I'd had months to process my discovery in private. The thought of meeting Richard's other children, seeing his features, reflected in faces that had been strangers to me 24 hours ago, made my stomach clench. But hadn't I forced a similar confrontation on them? Didn't I owe them at least the courtesy of answering their questions? I'll think about it, I said finally. Not today, maybe not this week. But eventually, yes. The rest of brunch passed with discussions of logistics. Thomas would stay at the house with me for a few days. Elizabeth would handle canceling the joint credit cards. Their spouses would field calls from concerned friends and family. A plan was taking shape, a way forward through the minefield Richard had laid around our lives. After brunch, Thomas drove me home. The house looked exactly as I'd left it the previous day, but felt fundamentally altered, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the knowledge of Richard's betrayal and now stood witness to the end of an era. Thomas carried my overnight bag upstairs, checked that all windows and doors were secure, then settled in the guest room with his laptop to begin the process of changing passwords on our shared accounts. Left alone in the bedroom I'd shared with Richard for decades, I opened his closet and stared at the precisely arranged suits and shirts, each one representing a different facet of his deception. The charcoal gray he wore to important court dates, the navy blue reserved for client meetings, the subtle pinstripes favored for depositions. And somewhere in Westlake, I imagined, another closet with another wardrobe, perhaps more casual clothes for his role as Rick, the family man who coached Little League. I began removing everything from the closet, methodically emptying it of Richard's presence. When Thomas came to check on me, he found me surrounded by piles of expensive menswear. "Mom, you don't have to do this now," he said gently. "Yes, I do," I replied, not pausing in my work. Every moment these things remain is another moment I'm living in a museum of lies. Thomas helped without further comment. By evening, we had packed all of Richard's clothing into bags and boxes, clearing out his closet, his dresser, his side of the bathroom. We left the boxes in the garage. Richard could arrange to collect them when I wasn't home. That night, I slept in the guest room, unwilling to lie in the bed I'd shared with a stranger for 40 years. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of parallel lives and hidden doors, leading to rooms I hadn't known existed in my own home. The doorbell rang at 7:30 the next morning. Thomas got there before I could, opening it to find Richard on the doorstep, unshaven and wearing the same clothes from the anniversary dinner, now rumpled as if he'd slept in them, or more likely, not slept at all. "I need to speak with your mother," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's not happening," Thomas replied firmly, blocking the entrance. "Thomas, please. She's still my wife. There are things she needs to understand. You forfeited any right to explanations when you maintained two families for 38 years. Thomas snapped, his composed façade cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've done to her? To us?" "Son, please don't call me that," Thomas said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Not now. Maybe not ever again." I appeared in the hallway behind Thomas, drawn by the confrontation. Richard's eyes found mine, desperate and pleading. "Catherine," he said, my name emerging as a broken sound. "Please, just 10 minutes. I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "The facts are clear, Richard. You've been living a double life for nearly our entire marriage. What explanation could possibly matter now?" "It wasn't what you think," he insisted. "I got trapped in an impossible situation. Elaine was pregnant, but I loved you. I couldn't bear to lose either of you. I thought it would be temporary, just until what?" I interrupted. "Until James was grown? Then Sarah came along and Michael. Decades passed, Richard. Every day, every hour, you made the choice to continue deceiving both of us." Richard's shoulders slumped. For the first time, I noticed how old he looked, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd realized, the gray in his hair more pronounced. Or perhaps I was simply seeing him clearly for the first time, without the filter of trust that had colored my perception for 40 years. "Meredith Chen will be handling the divorce," I said, referring to my attorney. "Have your lawyer contact her. Any communication between us will go through legal channels from now on. Catherine, please. Goodbye, Richard." I turned and walked away, back into the house that no longer felt like a home, but rather a stage set where I'd unwittingly performed in a play whose script had been written without my knowledge. Behind me, I heard Thomas firmly close the door, then the sound of Richard's car starting and pulling away from the curb. Later that day, Diana Reeves called with an update I hadn't expected. "Mrs. Wells, I've been contacted by Mrs. Donovan Wells, Elaine. She's requesting a meeting with you." I gripped the phone tighter. "Did she say why?" "She said she thinks you both deserve answers that only the other might have. She suggested meeting on neutral ground, with mediators present if you prefer." The thought of sitting across from the woman who had shared my husband for decades, comparing notes like members of some bizarre book club, made me feel slightly nauseated. Yet I couldn't deny a certain curiosity. What had Richard told her about his absences? What reasons had he given for the separate finances, the missed family events? "I'll consider it," I said, echoing my response about meeting Richard's other children. Not immediately, but perhaps in time. The next week passed in a blur of practical activities. I changed the locks, met with Meredith to begin formal divorce proceedings, and fielded carefully screened calls from a few close friends. Margaret Harrington came by with a casserole and a bottle of expensive whiskey. "For medicinal purposes," she said, embracing me tightly. "What Richard did was unforgivable, Catherine, and William and I want you to know we stand with you." I was touched by her loyalty, but not surprised. The Harringtons had always been people of principle. I wondered how many of our other friends would choose sides so decisively, how many would try to remain neutral, how many would distance themselves entirely from the messiness of our situation. 10 days after the anniversary dinner, I received an email from James Wells, Richard's eldest son with Elaine. The message was formal, almost clinical in its detachment. "Mrs. Wells, I hope this message finds you as well as can be expected under the circumstances. My siblings and I have been processing the revelations of last week and trying to make sense of a life that now appears to have been built on fundamental untruths. We understand that you may have no desire to engage with us, and we would respect that decision. However, if you are willing, we would like to meet briefly, not to assign blame or revisit painful details, but to acknowledge what we have unwittingly shared and perhaps find some measure of understanding that might help us all move forward. There is a coffee shop called Meridian on Elmwood Avenue that would provide neutral territory. We could meet at a time of your choosing, for as long or as short a duration as you prefer." Respectfully, James Wells. I read the email several times, struck by the measured tone, the careful consideration of my position. It revealed a maturity that spoke well of James, despite the circumstances of his upbringing. After consulting with Elizabeth and Thomas, who both offered to accompany me but understood when I declined, I replied with a proposed date and time. The meeting with James, Sarah, and Michael took place on a Tuesday afternoon. Meridian was quiet, most of the lunch crowd having returned to offices. I arrived early, selecting a table in the corner that offered some privacy while remaining in public view. When they entered, 3 adults who carried echoes of Richard in their features, I felt a strange doubling, as if I were seeing alternate versions of my own children in a parallel universe. The conversation began awkwardly, with careful introductions and polite offers to fetch coffee. Once we were settled with our drinks, an uncomfortable silence fell, no one quite knowing how to bridge the gulf between us. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," James finally said. He was the most like Richard in appearance, the same strong jawline, the same way of tilting his head slightly when speaking seriously. "We don't really know where to begin." "Perhaps with what you hope to gain from this meeting," I suggested, not unkindly but directly. "What questions do you have that I might be able to answer?" Sarah, the middle child, leaned forward. She had Richard's eyes but Elaine's coloring. "When did you discover us? Before the anniversary dinner, I mean." I explained the insurance policy, the private investigator, the months of evidence gathering while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. They listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances I couldn't interpret. "And in 40 years, you never suspected?" Michael asked. He was the youngest, with less of Richard in his features, but something of his manner in the precise way he arranged his coffee cup and napkin. "There were discrepancies," I admitted. "Unexplained absences, phone calls he took in another room, business trips that seemed to multiply as the years passed. But I trusted him. That was my choice, my mistake. It was his betrayal, not your mistake," Sarah said firmly. "Mom is saying the same thing, blaming herself for not seeing the signs. But he's the one who created this situation." I felt an unexpected kinship with Elaine in that moment, both of us revisiting decades of memories, reinterpreting them through the lens of new knowledge, wondering how we could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone we thought we knew. Completely. "What will you do now?" James asked after a pause. "Divorce him," I replied without hesitation. "Rebuild my life. Redefine myself outside the context of a marriage that wasn't what I believed it to be." I looked at each of them in turn. "And you? What are your intentions regarding your relationship with Richard?" They exchanged glances again, a silent communication that reminded me of how Thomas and Elizabeth often seemed to read each other's thoughts. "We haven't decided," Michael said. "Mom is struggling. She's staying with Sarah for now. Dad has been trying to contact all of us, but we're not ready to speak with him yet." "He needs to explain himself," Sarah added, a hard edge to her voice. "Not that any explanation could justify what he's done, but we need to understand how he could live like this for so long. How he could lie to our faces every day for our entire lives." James nodded in agreement. "The man we thought was our father, devoted, principled, honest to a fault, never existed. Or existed only in fragments, performances he put on when he was with us." He looked at me directly. "We've lost our father too, Mrs. Wells. Not in the same way you've lost your husband, but there's a similar grief." His insight struck me. I hadn't thought of my feelings as grief, but that's exactly what they were. Mourning not just for the marriage that had ended, but for the husband who had never truly existed as I'd believed him to be. "Will you keep his name?" I asked, realizing I didn't know if they shared my dilemma about this detail. "I'm considering changing mine," Sarah said. "I got married last year and took my husband's name, Ferguson, but kept Wells as my middle name. Now I'm thinking of dropping it entirely." "I haven't decided," James said. "On one hand, it's the only name I've ever had. On the other, every time I sign it, I'll be reminded." Michael shrugged. "I'm leaning toward keeping it. Whatever he did, he's still half of who I am genetically. I can't erase that, and I'm not sure I want to try." As our conversation drew to a close, an unexpected sense of connection had formed between us. Not the bond of a traditional family, but something more nuanced. A recognition of shared experience and mutual respect born from common trauma. "We won't take more of your time," James said as they prepared to leave. "But if you're open to it, perhaps we could meet again sometime. Not immediately, but when the rawness has faded a bit." I found myself nodding. I think I would like that. Not as Richard's wife meeting his other children, but as people finding our way forward from a situation none of us created, but all of us must navigate. As I watched them walk away, I felt something shift within me. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but perhaps the first tentative step toward whatever came next. For 40 years, I had been defined primarily as Richard's wife. Now I would define myself. 6 months after the anniversary dinner that had shattered the illusion of my marriage, I stood in the doorway of what had once been Richard's home office, surveying the empty space. The mahogany desk where he'd worked, on briefs late into the night, was gone. The wall of law books had been donated to the university's legal clinic. The filing cabinet that had concealed the Westlake insurance policy, the first domino in the collapse of my former life, had been removed, leaving only a faint rectangular outline on the carpet. The divorce proceedings were moving forward with surprising efficiency. Richard, perhaps hoping to minimize further public embarrassment, had agreed to my terms with little resistance. Meredith Chen, my attorney, had been both astonished and pleased by his cooperativeness. "Usually men like your husband fight tooth and nail," she'd commented during our last meeting, "especially over financial assets. But he's essentially agreeing to everything we've proposed." I had a theory about Richard's uncharacteristic acquiescence. "He's trying to buy my silence," I told Meredith. "He thinks if he gives me what I want financially, I won't share more details with his colleagues or the Bar Association." Meredith had raised an eyebrow. "And will you? Share more details, I mean." I'd considered the question carefully. The truth was I had enough evidence to potentially jeopardize Richard's law license. Maintaining two families through decades of deception demonstrated a pattern of dishonesty that might reasonably call into question his ethical fitness to practice law. But what would I gain from pursuing that avenue? More public attention, certainly. Perhaps some measure of additional revenge, but also more entanglement with a man I was trying to excise from my life. No, I'd decided finally. I've made my point. What happens to Richard now is no longer my concern. Now, standing in the empty office, I tried to envision what the space might become. A reading room, perhaps, or a studio for the watercolor painting I'd dabbled in before marriage and children had consumed my time. The possibilities stretched. Before me, limited only by my imagination, a fitting metaphor for this new chapter of my life. My phone chimed with a text from Elizabeth. "Lunch still on for 1? Bringing the girls if that's okay." I smiled as I typed back. "Of course, looking forward to it." My relationship with my children had deepened in unexpected ways since the revelation of Richard's double life. Initially focused on practical support, they had gradually become my confidants, allies in navigating emotional terrain none of us had expected to traverse. There had been anger, certainly, directed primarily at Richard, but occasionally spilling over onto me in moments of frustrated questioning. "How could you not have known? Why didn't you confront him immediately?" These outbursts were always followed by swift apologies, but I understood their source. My children were rewriting their own histories, questioning the authenticity of their childhood memories, wondering if the father they'd known had ever truly been present even when physically there. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Elizabeth was early, one of her many admirable traits, but when I opened the door, I found not my daughter but Elaine Donovan Wells standing on my porch. She looked different from the shell-shocked woman I'd glimpsed at the anniversary dinner, more composed, though still carrying visible weight in her expression. Her hair was neatly styled, her clothing tasteful but understated. In her hands, she clutched a manila envelope. "Catherine," she said, her voice steady but tentative. "I hope I'm not intruding. James mentioned you'd been willing to meet with them, and I thought perhaps—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. I considered closing the door. This was an intrusion, after all, into the sanctuary I'd been carefully rebuilding. But curiosity won out over defensiveness. "Would you like to come in?" I offered, stepping aside. Elaine hesitated, then nodded, following me into the living room. She perched on the edge of the sofa, her gaze moving around the space, taking in the changes I'd made. New artwork on the walls, furniture rearranged, all traces of Richard methodically erased. "Your home is lovely," she said politely. "Thank you. It's different now. I've been making changes." A moment of awkward silence stretched between us. Two women connected by decades of unwitting shared experience, yet fundamentally strangers to each other. "I won't take much of your time," Elaine finally said. I've been sorting through things, trying to make sense of it all." She placed the manila envelope on the coffee table. "I found these. I thought you might want to see them." I made no move to take the envelope. "What are they?" "Letters," she said. "From the early years, before email was common. Richard, Rick traveled frequently for work, or so I believed. He wrote to me from these trips. At least, that's what I thought at the time. My stomach tightened. You mean he was here, with me, while writing to you pretending to be elsewhere? Elaine nodded, a flash of shared pain crossing her features. Yes, and I imagine the reverse was also true. Times he was with me, writing to you with similar fabrications. She gestured to the envelope. There are date stamps on many of them, postmarks from cities he claimed to be visiting. I still didn't touch the envelope. Why would I want to read these? Because they contain a piece of the puzzle, Elaine said simply. I've been trying to reconstruct the truth, to separate reality from the elaborate fiction he created. These helped me begin to establish a timeline. I thought they might do the same for you. She paused. We don't have to be enemies, Catherine. We're both victims of the same man's deception. The word victims rankled. I had spent months reclaiming my agency, refusing to see myself as passive or powerless. Yet there was truth in what Elaine said. Neither of us had chosen this situation, had knowingly entered into this bizarre triangle. Have you been in contact with him? I asked, changing the subject. Elaine's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Initially, no. I refused his calls, returned his letters unopened. But eventually, yes, we've spoken several times. And he's provided what he considers explanations, justifications, really. She shook her head slightly. According to Richard, it began as a temporary arrangement. He met me while already engaged to you. When I became pregnant unexpectedly, he panicked. Couldn't bear to lose you, couldn't abandon me and his child. He claims he intended to resolve the situation, but time passed, more children came, and the deception calcified into a way of life. I laughed, the sound devoid of humor. How convenient for him. Did you believe this narrative? I believe he believes it, Elaine said carefully. Men like Richard, like Rick, are masters of self-justification. They construct realities that allow them to live with their choices. Her insight surprised me. You seem to have analyzed this quite thoroughly. I've had excellent therapy, she replied with a hint of wry humor. A necessity under the circumstances. Something shifted in the atmosphere between us. Not quite camaraderie, but a kind of recognition. We were two intelligent women who had been deceived by the same skilled liar, now working to reconstruct our understanding of decades of shared history. Would you like some tea? I found myself offering. Elaine accepted, and we moved to the kitchen, where the familiar ritual of boiling water and selecting tea bags provided a welcome structure to our unusual encounter. As we sat at the kitchen table, cradling steaming mugs, the conversation flowed more naturally. James mentioned you might be keeping the house, Elaine said. I nodded. And you? What will happen with the Westlake property? Selling it. Too many memories. I'm looking at condominiums nearer to Sarah's family. She took a cautious sip of tea. The grandchildren are what keep me going some days. They're innocent in all this. Yes, I agreed, thinking of my own grandchildren, whose lives had been peripherally but significantly impacted by their grandfather's deception. They're the future, untainted by the past. We talked for nearly an hour, comparing notes on Richard's methods of deception, the elaborate systems he had maintained to keep his dual lives separate. There was an almost academic quality to our discussion, as if we were analyzing a complex case study rather than our own lived experience. As Elaine prepared to leave, she gestured to the manila envelope, still untouched on the coffee table. Will you read them? I considered the question. Perhaps. Not today, but sometime. She nodded, in understanding. They helped me in a strange way, made the past more comprehensible, even if they couldn't make it acceptable. She hesitated at the door. Catherine, I want you to know, I never knew about you. Not until that night at the Hawthorne. Whatever you might think of me, please believe that. I studied her face, searching for signs of deception and finding none. I believe you, I said finally. And I hope you believe that I never knew about you either. After Elaine left, I returned to the empty office space, my mind churning with our conversation. I had never expected to feel any connection with my husband's other wife, yet there had been moments of genuine understanding between us. We had both been actors in Richard's elaborately staged production, reading from scripts he had written, performing roles he had assigned us. But now we were writing our own stories. My phone chimed again, Elizabeth checking if she should pick up lunch on her way over. The mundane question grounded me, pulling me back from philosophical reflection to practical reality. This was my life now. Lunch with my daughter and granddaughters, plans for redecorating empty rooms, decisions made solely for my own benefit. When Elizabeth arrived with the twins, the house filled with the chaotic energy only small children can generate. As we ate sandwiches and the girls regaled me with tales from kindergarten, I found myself smiling genuinely, present in a way I hadn't been for months, perhaps for years. You seem lighter today, Mom, Elizabeth observed after the girls had gone to play in the backyard. I had an unexpected visitor, I replied, explaining Elaine's appearance and our conversation. Elizabeth's eyes widened. I don't know what that is. Weird? Brave? Both? Both, I agreed. But also oddly helpful. There's something to be said for comparing notes with the only other person who truly understands the scope of what Richard did. And the letters? Elizabeth asked, noticing the envelope. Will you read them? I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to know everything, to fully understand the extent of his deception. Another part wants to move forward without entangling myself further in the past. Elizabeth considered this. Maybe there's a middle path. Knowledge without obsession, understanding without being consumed by it. Her wisdom, so beyond her years, made my heart swell with pride. When did you get so insightful? She shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. I had a good teacher. After Elizabeth and the twins left, I found myself drawn back to the empty office. Standing in the center of the room, I closed my eyes and tried to envision its future. The image that formed was unexpected. Not a reading room or art studio, but a small classroom. A space where I could tutor disadvantaged students, sharing my love of literature and language with young minds eager to learn. Before retirement, teaching had been my passion, my purpose outside the boundaries of marriage and motherhood. It had been the one area of my life where Richard's influence hadn't reached, where I had maintained a separate identity grounded in my own expertise and abilities. The idea took hold, expanding in my imagination. I could volunteer at the community center, offer free English tutoring to immigrant families, perhaps even teach creative writing workshops for seniors looking to document their life stories. The possibilities multiplied, each one more energizing than the last. That evening, I finally opened Elaine's envelope, spreading the letters across my dining room table in chronological order. I read them not with jealousy or anger, but with the detached interest of a literary scholar analyzing an unreliable narrator. Richard's written voice was recognizable, yet somehow different in these pages, more effusive, less measured than in the letters and cards he had written to me over the years. It was as if he had created distinct personalities to match his distinct lives. As I read, I began to fill in a timeline on a legal pad, dates, locations, events mentioned. Patterns emerged, business trips that coincided with our children's birthdays, or school performances, family emergencies that pulled him away from important moments in our shared life. The magnitude of his deception was both breathtaking and, strangely, clarifying. No one could maintain such elaborate fabrications without being fundamentally, intrinsically dishonest. The revelation wasn't about me or Elaine. It was about Richard's character, his core identity. When I finished the last letter, I gathered them carefully, returned them to their envelope, and placed it in a box destined for storage. Not thrown away, but not occupying space in my daily life either. Knowledge without obsession, as Elizabeth had suggested. 1 year to the day after the anniversary dinner that had exposed Richard's double life, I hosted a different kind of gathering in my home, now truly mine in every sense, legally and emotionally. The guests included Thomas and his family, Elizabeth and hers, several colleagues from the university, and friends who had stood by me throughout the upheaval of the past year. The occasion was the official launch of Second Chapters, the literacy program I had founded at the community center, offering tutoring and mentorship to adults seeking to improve their reading and writing skills. Many of the program's volunteer tutors were seated around my dining table, raising glasses to celebrate our first successful semester. To new beginnings, Margaret Harrington toasted, her eyes meeting mine with warmth and approval. And to endings, I added, that make those beginnings possible. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Thomas lingered in the kitchen, helping me load the dishwasher. You know, Mom, he said thoughtfully. A year ago, I was worried about you, afraid you might never recover from what Dad did. I smiled, handing him a plate to rinse. I was worried too for a while. But now I understand something I didn't then. What's that? That his betrayal didn't define me. It revealed me. I set down the glass I was holding, turning to face my son fully. It showed me my strength, my resilience, my capacity for reinvention. In trying to diminish me, Richard ultimately helped me discover who I truly am, beyond the role of wife. Thomas nodded, a mixture of pride and something like reverence in his expression. And who is that exactly? I considered the question, not just as my son had posed it, but as I had been asking it of myself throughout this year of transformation. The answer came with perfect clarity. I am Catherine Wells, I said, the name feeling complete without Richard's surname attached to it. I am a teacher, a mother, a grandmother, a friend. I am a woman who refused to be defined by betrayal, who chose to build something meaningful from the wreckage of deception. I am, finally and completely, myself. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen of a house that had once been a stage for someone else's elaborate deception, but was now simply, authentically my home, I felt something I had not expected to feel again. Peace. Not the false peace of ignorance, but the hard-won peace of truth, of self-knowledge, of a life reclaimed and redirected toward purpose. The anniversary dinner had been an ending, yes, but more importantly, it had been a beginning. My beginning. 3 years after the anniversary dinner that had exposed Richard's double life, I found myself in an unlikely position, seated across from James Wells at an outdoor cafe in Boston, reviewing a manuscript he had written about our shared experience. I changed all the names, of course, he explained, nervously watching my expression as I turned the pages. And I've been careful to present multiple perspectives, not just my own. The book, titled Fractured Reflections, Growing Up in a Family. Built on lies, was James's attempt to process his experience as Richard's oldest son from his relationship with Elaine. When he'd first approached me about the project 18 months earlier, my instinct had been to decline any involvement. I had moved forward with my life, established new patterns and purposes. Revisiting the past seemed counterproductive, but James had been persistent, respectful, but determined. This isn't just about exposing Dad, he'd insisted during a phone call that had stretched longer than I'd intended. It's about understanding how deception shapes the people caught in its web, how children internalize parental behavior, how families construct narratives that define them, how truth can be both devastating and liberating. His eloquence and sincerity had eventually persuaded me to meet with him periodically as he worked on the manuscript. Our conversations had evolved from cautious exchanges about Richard to deeper discussions about identity, trust, and resilience. James, I discovered, had inherited his father's analytical mind, but coupled it with a level of emotional intelligence and ethical awareness that Richard had conspicuously lacked. "What do you think?" James asked now, his expression a mix of professional curiosity and personal vulnerability. At 39, he bore an uncanny resemblance to the Richard I had married, though his demeanor was entirely his own. "It's remarkably balanced," I replied honestly. "I expected more anger." James nodded, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I was angry, furious really, for the first year. But eventually I realized that staying angry was keeping me connected to him in a way I didn't want to be. Writing this has been a way to process that anger, to transform it into something constructive." I understood that impulse completely. My own journey had followed a similar trajectory, though I had processed my feelings through action rather than words. Building the literacy program, mentoring students, creating a life defined by what I offered rather than what had been taken from me. "Have you shown this to your mother?" I asked, returning the manuscript to its folder. "Parts of it. She's still—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Raw, I guess. The betrayal hit her differently." I nodded, understanding the distinction, without judgment. Elaine and I had maintained a cordial if distant relationship since our tea in my kitchen. Occasional emails, rare phone calls when specific issues required discussion. We had taken different paths in the aftermath of Richard's exposure. I had divorced him definitively and recreated myself independently, while Elaine had engaged in a prolonged process of confrontation and attempted understanding. Last I'd heard, she was still in periodic contact with Richard, who had relocated to Arizona after the divorce was finalized. Whether their communication was driven by unresolved feelings or practical matters related to their shared children and grandchildren, I didn't know and didn't ask. My own relationship with Richard had been reduced to formal communications through attorneys, then tapered to nothing once legal matters were settled. "How's the program going?" James asked, changing the subject. He had visited second chapters several times, even volunteering occasionally as a writing coach for adult learners. "Expanding," I replied, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "We've opened a second location in Hartford. The waiting list for tutoring is over 50 people now." What had begun as a small literacy initiative had grown into a comprehensive educational support system for adults seeking to improve their lives through reading and writing. I had secured grants, recruited volunteers, developed curriculum. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. "And the book club? Still meeting?" I smiled at his question. The book club had been an unexpected outgrowth of my personal journey. A gathering of women in their 60s and 70s, most divorced or widowed, who met monthly to discuss literature and life. It had begun almost accidentally when Margaret Harrington introduced me to several friends going through major life transitions. Our first meeting, intended as casual social support, had evolved into a regular forum for intellectual and emotional exploration. "Thriving," I confirmed. "We're tackling Middlemarch next month." James laughed. "Ambitious." "Life's too short for simple reads," I replied, a phrase that had become something of a motto among the book club members. As our lunch concluded and we prepared to part ways, James surprised me with an invitation. "Sarah's youngest is graduating high school next month. She's having a small celebration at her place in Westlake. She asked me to invite you if you're comfortable with the idea." I paused, considering the implications. I had met James's siblings several times over the past 3 years, but always on neutral ground, cafes, restaurants, once a museum. Entering their family space, the community where Richard had built his parallel life, was a different proposition entirely. "Would your mother be there?" I asked. "Yes," James admitted. "And possibly Dad, though Sarah's made it clear to him that you would be the priority guest if there's any conflict." The fact that they would prioritize my comfort over Richard's presence touched me unexpectedly. These were not my children, not my family in any traditional sense. Yet some connection had formed between us. A bond forged in shared experience and mutual respect. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "I'll let you know next week." On the train back to Connecticut, I found myself contemplating this latest development. 3 years ago, the idea of attending a family function with Richard's other children would have seemed absurd, even painful. Now it registered as merely complex, requiring careful consideration, but not triggering the visceral rejection it once would have. I'd learned that healing wasn't linear. It came in unexpected moments, through surprising connections, through teaching adults who had never completed high school, but showed more courage than I'd ever needed to muster, through friendships with women who had reinvented themselves multiple times throughout their lives, through conversations with James, Sarah, and Michael, who had every reason to resent me for exposing their father, but had instead approached me with curiosity, and eventually, remarkably, with something like kinship. That evening, I discussed the invitation with Elizabeth during our weekly phone call. My daughter had become my closest confidant, our relationship deepening beyond the traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a friendship between equals. "It's entirely your choice, Mom," she said after listening to my conflicted thoughts. "No, one would blame you for declining." "I know," I sighed. "But part of me feels like refusing would be letting Richard determine my boundaries, even now." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "You know what I admire most about how you've handled all this? You've never let bitterness become your compass. You've made choices based on what feels right and true to you, not what would hurt Dad the most." Her insight struck a chord. Throughout this journey, I had tried to remain guided by my own internal sense of rightness rather than reactivity. Sometimes, that meant maintaining distance. Other times, it meant opening to unexpected connections. "I think I'll go," I decided, the words feeling right as I spoke them, with clear boundaries, but open to whatever emerges. The following month brought another unexpected development. A producer from a documentary series focusing on family secrets contacted me, having heard about our story through James's literary agent. The producer was interested in featuring our situation in an episode examining long-term deception within marriages. My initial reaction was skepticism. I had worked hard to build a life focused on contribution rather than on my identity as a wronged wife. Participating in a documentary seemed like stepping backwards, reopening wounds that had largely healed. But James saw it differently when we discussed it over coffee. "It's not about rehashing the past," he argued. "It's about sharing what we've learned, maybe helping others who are going through similar situations know they're not alone." I remained uncertain until a letter arrived from a woman in Portland who had read an article about second chapters that mentioned my background. "Your story gave me courage," she wrote. "After finding out about my husband's decade-long affair, I was drowning in shame and indecision. Hearing how you rebuilt your life reminded me that his choices don't define me. That letter shifted my perspective. Perhaps sharing our experience more broadly could serve some purpose beyond my own concerns, not as exposé or revenge, but as testament to resilience and renewal." When I called the producer back, I established clear conditions. The documentary would focus on healing and rebuilding rather than sensationalizing betrayal. Richard would be a peripheral figure rather than the center, and I would have input on the final edit of my segments. 6 months later, as filming concluded, I found myself sitting in Sarah Wells Ferguson's backyard, surrounded by an improbable gathering: Thomas and Elizabeth with their families, James, Sarah, and Michael, even Elaine, who had approached this project with initial reluctance but eventual thoughtful participation. The documentary crew captured our conversation as we reflected on the journey from deception to discovery to rebuilding. The strangest outcome Thomas observed during a break in filming, is that Dad's betrayal ultimately created connections none of us could have anticipated. Looking around at this blended group, not quite a family in the traditional sense, but a community of sorts, bound by shared experience and mutual respect, I had to agree. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, I replied. The question is whether we have the courage to walk the unexpected ones with grace. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of my journey. Not simply that betrayal could be survived, but that what came after could be rich with meaning and connection, if we remained open to possibilities beyond the confines of conventional narratives. At 68, I was not the woman I had expected to be. I was something more complex, more resilient, and ultimately more authentic, shaped not just by Richard's deception, but by my own choices in its aftermath. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.